Numerous civilizations have contributed to the history of modern-day science, but at the foundation of this endeavor we call science, it could be easily argued that no culture was more foundational than a civilization that is so unknown they don't even have a name. So, for a lack of a better word, I'm going to call them the civilization of Transoxiana. Welcome to the 6th video in this series on the history of astronomy. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back, and if this is your first time here, hopefully you'll find something you like. If so, please be sure to let the YouTube algorithm know about it. Transoxiana. Where exactly is that? Technically speaking, Transoxiana means the other side of the Oxus River, which is this river right here, which, roughly speaking, runs along the border of modern-day Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan. But this civilization did not strictly exist on the other side of the Oxus River. They existed in this general area here. I'm just using the term Transoxiana for a lack of a better word. So throughout this video, I may say Transoxiana or Central Asia. I'm really meaning this general area in purple, which could roughly be considered the area between the Caspian Sea and the Hindu Kush. It's essentially where all the countries ending in stan are today. In case you're wondering where I'm getting this information from, it pretty much all comes from this book by Central Asian historian Frederick Starr called Lost Enlightenment. I'm only going to scratch the surface in this video, so if you find this interesting, I would recommend checking out this book. The history of this part of the world goes all the way back to the Bronze Age with the BMAC civilization, which stands for Bactria-Margiana Archaeological Complex. This is also sometimes called the Oxus Civilization. This BMAC civilization was very similar to Mesopotamia, in that it was centered in a generally arid climate with some rivers running through it, and as a result, the civilization was largely centered around water management, learning to build canals and control water for things like irrigation. The BMAC civilization had close cultural ties to the Indus Valley civilization, as well as the Sumerians. How close, we don't know exactly, as we don't know what language they spoke. It does appear that they did not speak an Indo-Aryan language. The Andronovo culture above it in red are the early Indo-Aryans, or the Proto-Indo-Aryans. At this time, they were steppe nomads. Given that both the Sumerians and the Indus Valley civilization practiced astronomy to some extent, it's very likely the BMAC civilization also practiced some astronomy. Was it connected to these other civilizations? We don't know. We do know they were connected at least through trade. However, the BMAC civilization is not the culture I'm going to be talking about in this video. The culture I'm talking about existed roughly between antiquity and the Arab conquest around 700 AD. You could think of this as the civilization of the Silk Road. The Roman historian Strabo, who lived around the year 0, called this part of the world the land of 1,000 cities. Now mind you, this guy's living in the Roman Empire, and he's calling this place the land of 1,000 cities. So this is a major civilization. Some of the more famous of these 1,000 cities are Balkh, Merv, Samarkand, Bukhara, Herat. Of course, there's many more, but I'm not going to spend the video listing 1,000 cities. Balkh, by the way, was known as the mother of all cities. I should add, this is not really a civilization, a unified political civilization. These are more like city-states with a common culture. If you're finding this video interesting so far, help me out by giving a little hint to the YouTube algorithm and liking and subscribing, and maybe sharing it with a few friends. At this time, the local languages were largely Iranian languages. These languages are the ancestral cousins, you might say, of modern-day Iranian languages spoken in Tajikistan and Afghanistan. Being at the center of the Silk Road, this part of the world was a crossroad of cultures, so many different cultures could be found here, as well as other languages that were not the local Iranian languages. How did Greeks end up here, you might be wondering, as this is nowhere near Greece, but remember that Alexander the Great's empire reached all the way to India, and following Alexander the Great, a number of Greek-like civilizations were in this general area, such as the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. Today, this area is dominated by Turkic-speaking peoples, but at the time, Turks dominated the Eurasian steppe. They were still steppe nomads, so they basically replaced the Indo-Aryan steppe nomads, who themselves had moved into these cities. And eventually the Turks would move into the cities, and so today these cities are dominated by Turkic languages. Seeing as this was a crossroad of cultures, we also see numerous religions being practiced here. but at this time the dominant religions were Buddhism and Zoroastrianism. Now you might be asking yourself, if this is such a major and influential civilization, how come I've never heard of it? Well, the main reason is that when the Arabs, and specifically the Umayyad Arabs, conquered this land, they proudly burned all the libraries and books this civilization or this culture had. And apparently this land was scattered with libraries. This may come as a surprise, as the Islamic world is largely known for its paper revolution and enormous amount of literary work. Well, that's true, but that came later. Initially, the Arabs were desert nomads. They didn't care about books. Books are heavy, they don't want to carry them around. So at the time, they had no value for books and libraries, and in this case, they're burning them mainly to demonstrate their dominance over the culture they've just conquered. And unfortunately, in our history of science and astronomy, this will not be the last time it happens. So as a result of this destruction by the Arab conquests, nobody really knew the civilization existed until the 20th century when some texts were accidentally discovered by a farmer digging in his backyard. As a result, this sparked some archaeological interest in the area, where it was discovered that this civilization or this culture appeared to have been fully literate, as many of the texts uncovered were writings from common folk, people writing to their husbands or wives about regular everyday family activities. It was not just the elite or the literati who were writing for purposes of government control or government bookkeeping. This may very well be the first fully literate society in human history. This is corroborated by accounts by Chinese travelers writing about the civilization at the time, who reported back to China that in this civilization, all children learned to read and write at the age of 5, as well as learning to count, and that their math was done using a set of numbers they got from the Hindus. So they were using Hindu numerals. In fact, they seem to have adopted Hindu numerals as a society even before the Indians, even though the Indians are the ones who invented it. If you watch my video on Indian astronomy, you'll know that the Hindu numerical system, the system almost the entire world uses today, while it was invented in India, it took some time to be fully adopted by Indian society. Initially, only mathematicians and astronomers were using it, but the inhabitants of this civilization, which was a largely trade-based economy, all needed to know how to do good bookkeeping as traders, so they all needed to know how to read and write and count. Now, what did they write on? Well, it turns out they wrote on paper. Paper, you may know, was invented by the Chinese, and you may have heard this story that it spread to the Arabs and to the rest of the world as a result of the Battle of Talas, where some Chinese captives gave the secret of paper to the Arabs. However, this contradicts the historical record. This story is almost certainly made up, as paper is found in this region of the world well before the Arab conquests, and in fact, even paper mills are found scattered all over this land, dating as far back as the 3rd century. So this culture had learned about paper from the Chinese, and had learned to make it themselves. In fact, they even specialized in it. Paper from Samarkand was different than paper from Balkh or paper from Bukhara. The Arabs learned about paper from this civilization. A similar story can be said about silk production, where we find evidence of silk production as early as the 4th century in this region of the world. They learned about silk from the Chinese, but then figured out it'd be much better if we produced it ourselves. Eventually, the Umayyads are overthrown in the Abbasid Revolution, bringing on the Abbasid Caliphate. The Umayyads were overthrown largely because they had a policy of Arab supremacy, but Arabs are actually a very small population from the desert, and almost everyone they were ruling over were non-Arabs, so this caused a lot of unhappiness. When the Abbasids took over, they changed from this Arab supremacy to Muslim supremacy, so now at least anyone could just convert to Islam and enjoy the perks of being a first-class citizen. And notice that if we look at the map of the Abbasid Empire, Transoxiana is actually more of a vassal state. This was actually quite typical for this civilization. They were always on the border of major empires. As a result, they were often being conquered by these large empires. However, they could never really keep control over the land. These city-states of Transoxiana were perfectly content just paying off their invaders, as they were very wealthy due to the Silk Road. Here's your money, now just leave us alone. The Abbasid Revolution was actually largely led by a member of this culture, named Abu Muslim, who came from Khorasan, which is this area right here. Now the Abbasids immediately take on advisors from this culture. In particular, the most famous would be the Barmakid family, who become viziers to the Abbasid caliphs. The Barmakids were a prominent family from Balkh, Balkh being located right here. There's actually a few prominent families from these caravan cities taken on as Abbasid advisors, and in the book he talks about all this sort of political intrigue between these families, competing over who's going to be pulling the strings behind the scenes. Actually, they should probably make a movie about it, as people seem to like those kind of movies. The Barmakids end up introducing this culture of reading and writing and math and science in general to the Arabs. The first thing they do is they design the city of Baghdad, which is famously a round city, which apparently was pretty typical in Transoxiana. They are also responsible for building the first libraries and paper mills in the Arab world. As a result, the Central Asians have an enormous cultural influence on the Muslim world. For example, in Muslim literature, we already saw that they introduced paper making and books and libraries to the Arabs, and this led to the Paper Revolution, where paper spread all over the Islamic world, and eventually paper spread into Europe and to the rest of the world. Many stories from the famous tales of the 1001 Nights, sometimes called 1001 Arabian Nights, seem to have originated from Transoxiana, or at least passed through it. This is where we get the stories of Aladdin and Sinbad and Ali Baba and many others. In these stories, there is a reoccurring character based off of Jafar al-Barmaki, one of the Barmaki viziers. This name may in fact ring a bell. They also have a large influence on architecture. We already saw that they introduced circular cities to the Arabs. Now, to be fair, circular cities existed in other places in the world, but the Arabs got the idea from the Barmakids. It also appears that the architecture that is considered typical Islamic architecture, consisting of domes, towers, and pointed arches, likely is actually based off of architecture from Transoxiana, or from these caravan cities. In particular in Buddhist temples such as stupas, which actually were very common in Transoxiana, as Buddhism was one of the more prominent religions at the time. So, shh, don't tell the Muslims, but it turns out their architecture may actually be Buddhist architecture. But for the purposes of this video, the most important influence we're concerned with is science and technology. We already saw these people were masters of canals and irrigation. To be fair, so were the people in Mesopotamia, so it's unclear how much of that technology came from Transoxiana. They also taught them about wind catchers. Wind catchers are an architectural feature that is found all over the Middle East and generally the Muslim world. These towers are an ancient method of keeping buildings cool by circulating cool air through them through the use of this tall tower. They were in widespread use in Transoxiana prior to the Arab conquests. And today, wind catchers are becoming more and more popular as they can keep your building cool at no energy cost and no emissions. The Central Asians also introduced windmills to the Arabs. It's unclear if they were invented by the Central Asians or if they got the idea from somewhere else, but they seem to have been common in Central Asia, and as a result of the Arab conquest, they spread through the Arab world and eventually into Europe. They also introduced ideas of medicine and astronomy, which they largely got from mixing ideas from the Greeks and the Indians. For example, they teach the Arabs about mural sextants, observatories that allow you to measure the altitude angle of a star above the horizon. If you're a little bit familiar with the history of astronomy, you may have heard of the famous mural sextant built by Tycho Brahe in Denmark. Textbooks generally present this as this great idea he had for making astronomical observations and accurate and precise measurements. But actually, these mural sextant observatories were found all over the Islamic world, going back at least 700 years before Tycho Brahe was even born. If anything, he probably literally built the last one in history, as after him, people started using telescopes to look at the sky, and they became obsolete. Finally, and most importantly, they introduced the Hindu decimal system to the Arabs, which eventually spreads all around the world and is pretty much used by everyone today. Really, this lost, unknown civilization with no name from Transoxiana is responsible for the Islamic Golden Age, which in turn leads to the scientific revolution in Europe. And it all started with Al-Khwarizmi. Al-Khwarizmi, as his name indicates, comes from the land of Khwarazm, which is the area south of the Aral Sea. He is the one who brought the decimal system to the Arab Empire, in a book called Kitab al-Hisab al-Hindi. And because at this time the Islamic Arab-speaking world went from India all the way to the Atlantic, the numbers spread all across the empire and eventually into Europe and eventually the rest of the world. He was made the head of the Library of Baghdad, which may have been called the House of Wisdom. It's unclear if this is actually the name of the library or sort of a philosophical school of thought. For sure, there was a main library in Baghdad. In fact, there were probably numerous libraries in Baghdad, and he was appointed head of this library by the Caliph. He is also the one who invented algebra in a book called Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabalah. I almost certainly butchered the pronunciation as I don't speak Arabic, but you'll notice that in this title we have the word al-Jabr, which is where they get the term algebra from. It means something like the completing or the balancing. He was also appointed head astronomer of Baghdad, where he introduced Indian astronomy to the Arabs, starting with the book Zij as Sindhind. This is the reason we do trigonometry the Indian way, not the Greek way, because of this guy. Because the math in his culture was primarily based off of Indian math. Trigonometry was basically invented for the purpose of astronomy, and I discussed the difference between Indian and Greek trigonometry in my previous video on Indian astronomy. As an astronomer, he suggests the possibility of elliptical orbits. Now, he wasn't the first to do this. The Indians were actually the first to do this, but he also puts this idea out there, and we would find out hundreds of years later that this is actually correct. Probably the reason this idea didn't catch on at this time or during the Indians is because they were still in favor of a geocentric model, but this elliptical orbits idea only works for a heliocentric model. He also does a lot of work in geography and geodesy, making measurements of the size of the Earth or the distance of 1 degree across the Earth, and he makes maps of the Earth, largely based off of the work of Ptolemy. It could easily be argued that this might be the most influential scientist in human history. And he certainly was very influential on later Europe. In fact, he was known in Europe as Al-Khwarizmi, which is where we get the word algorithm from. It's no coincidence that a large number of the polymaths from the Islamic Golden Age, especially early on, come from Transoxiana, or Central Asia. At the time, the capital of the Abbasid Empire is Baghdad, in present-day Iraq, and we saw that Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm, south of the Aral Sea. There are actually some earlier Islamic polymaths than Al-Khwarizmi. For example, Al-Marwazi, who comes from Merv. You'll notice that very often the names of these guys is just the place they're from, so Marwazi means from Merv, Khwarizmi means from Khwarazm. After Al-Khwarizmi, we have Abu Mashar from Balkh, Al-Farghani from Farghana Valley. We have the Banu Musa from Khorasan, which is this general area right here. Banu Musa are actually 3 brothers. Banu Musa means sons of Musa. Their father Musa was from Khorasan and was hired as an astronomer by the Baghdad court. We also have Ibn Turk from Kutal, or possibly from Gilan, south of the Caspian Sea. Al-Tabari from Amol, also south of the Caspian Sea. There's a bunch of guys named Al-Tabari, as the general area south of the Caspian Sea is called Tabaristan. Gurgani from Gurgan. Al-Razi from Ray. Al-Farabi from Faryab, or from Farab. It's unclear which city this refers to. Al-Hazin, also from Khorasan. Al-Sufi, also from Ray. Abu al-Wafa from Buzgan. Al-Hujandi from Hujand. Abu Sal, also from Amol. Al-Sijji from Shijistan in modern-day Afghanistan. Harawi from Herat. Abu Nasr Mansur, also from Gilan. Al-Biruni from Kath. Kath today is actually called Biruni. In fact, most of these cities still exist today. Ibn Sina from Bukhara. Sarani from Saran. And there's like a dozen Al-Tusis from Tus. And then there's also a bunch from Tus that are not called Al-Tusi. There are many other Muslim polymaths. I'm only scratching the surface here, but you get the idea. A large number of these early Muslim polymaths came from this civilization. Now, of course, with Baghdad being the center of the caliphate, you get a lot of guys coming from here as well. But some of those, like the Banu Musa, would have originated from this culture in Central Asia, and their parents or their ancestors had moved to the capital. Eventually, these Arab polymaths would come from all over the Arab world as the ideas spread westward. Possibly the most, or one of the most important things we get from this culture is the scientific method. I know, you've always been told the scientific method was given to us by Newton. He invented it. But that's just simply not true. Actually, it was around well before him and was explicitly described by a number of Muslim polymaths, in particular Al-Razi, Al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, and Al-Haytham. Al-Haytham was from Basra in Iraq, but the other three all came from Central Asia, or Transoxiana, and they all wrote something along the lines of, the only way to know the truth about the natural world is through evidence and repeated experimentation. And they certainly lived according to this principle. And it could be easily argued that even though they never wrote it explicitly, Al-Marwazi and Al-Khwarizmi also adhered to this philosophy, based on their general attitude towards scientific endeavors. In fact, Al-Marwazi, as well as Al-Razi, in particular Al-Razi, both got in trouble with the Caliphate for applying this philosophy to the Quran, where they started doubting some of the claims made about Muhammad, claiming you have no evidence for these events. Well, the Caliphate didn't take too kindly to that. And actually, it would appear that many of these polymaths from Transoxiana were actually atheists. They are probably the earliest known atheists in recorded history. That shouldn't be too much of a surprise, as you might recall, this part of the world was filled with a bunch of different religions. So if you're somewhat of a critical thinker there, you might start to think, well, not all of these religions can be right. None of these claims have sufficient evidence supporting them. Most of these Islamic polymaths had huge influence across the Arab world and in Europe. In fact, many of them were sufficiently known that they developed Europeanized garblings of their names. So I hope now you understand why it can be argued that this civilization, this unknown culture from Central Asia, may be the most important culture in the foundations of modern science. They are responsible for triggering the Islamic Golden Age, which eventually spreads into Europe, which is what we'll take a look at in the next video on the history of astronomy. So if you enjoyed this video and would like to continue this journey in the history of astronomy, be sure to like and subscribe and hit the bell to be notified for the release of future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.